please forgive the black and white, or don't. But the reason it's being used is I wanted to make this video on the balcony because it's pleasant outside, but my balcony light is harsh and disgusting. So this is the workaround since it is dark outside. Anyway, I wanted to make this video because of a sentiment I've seen going around. It is not a hit piece on Advance. I want to make that unmistakably clear. I love Advance. It's my second favorite of the OU generations. The reason I am choosing to highlight its problems is not because I have a particular bone to pick with Advance, at least not any more than anyone who plays a metagame does. Like, oh, I love DPP, but insert stupid thing here. Like, not just Jirachi, but, other little details that come from experiencing the ins and outs of the tier and not just the surface level. So that's mostly where my gripes from Advance come from. And it's not about just airing those grievances, but more so in the context of there being a lot of people who posit Advance as this kind of utopia. Now, if you think Advance is the best metagame, I am not really going to disagree with you heavily. Yes, I prefer DPP, but if you think Advance is the best, then I'm not going to say, no, absolutely not. How could you possibly think that way? Like, of course, it has a very, very strong case for the best metagame, maybe the best. I don't really care to split the differences at this point. The reason why I feel the need to point out these flaws is not so much for the sake of knocking Advance down a peg in people's minds, but more so to point out their, I think, erroneous way of thinking about other generations, because this is incredibly common. A day-to-day site that you will see someone say, "Oh, DPP, GSC, whatever metagame, throw it in there, is a complete awful, unplayable mess. Coin flips, whatever." Advance, on the other hand, is a haven of competitive purity. There's nothing to be, found within it that would besmirch the competitive experience whatsoever. All the other metagames are horrible, and Advance is perfect. You know, and it's not to knock Advance down, but it's more that people will complain about XYZ and DPP, let's say, and then they will completely skirt over the many elements of Advance, let's say, that are less than desirable for the competitive experience. So I don't pretend to know where this comes from. If I had to hazard a guess, it's the fact that Advance is very balanced. I mean, of course it is. And there's just enough creative spark to where you feel like everything is viable, right? But I have ranted many times about the delusion of many a player base, including the advanced player base, deluding themselves into thinking, um, well, the Snorlax thing is too easy at this point. It's because, again, I should clarify before someone says, oh, BKC's take about Snorlax is just bad. When it's always, or not always, but very often, I won't touch that. I was going to start making some judgments. But I will say, my point against Snorlax isn't that Snorlax is bad, it's that the teams with it are bad. And there are very few ways to make a good team with Snorlax. Very, very few. And most of the teams that people do use with Snorlax are heinously flawed. But this is not a Snorlax hit piece either. Uh, it's more the flaws of Advance that I have found throughout thinking about it more than any human should think about anything, perhaps. And I think people skirt over these flaws. They don't see them, or they skirt over them. Whatever it is, if it's selective thinking because, oh, Advance is perfect and I hate GSC because I hate Thunder accuracy, whatever it is, I would like to offer a counterpoint to that. So the takeaway from this should not be, oh, actually, BKC, you're right, Advance sucks, because that's not it. I really think that most metagames are on relatively equal footing, as far as competitiveness goes. If you want to split hairs about uh, black and white versus Oris or whatever, that's up to you. You can do that if you like. My thing is more that Advance is getting deified, which is fine. I think Advance is amazing too. But then these other tiers, which are really not so dissimilar from it, vis-a-vis the uncompetitive or the silly or however you want to phrase it aspects of those metagames, then they just get ripped to shreds. And I would like to, stop repeating myself, which is why I will start naming those elements now. Okay, the core dynamic of advance that I think people kind of delude themselves into thinking isn't the case is the Skarmory factor. Skarmory, number one Pokemon in the tier, whatever you think it is, that's not really the point. The point is that Skarmory teams are clearly the best and most consistent, right? Okay, that's not a problem. Something has to be the best and most consistent, right? Now, the main issue, I think, is that it's not about Skarmory being the best. It's more about the fact, which I have said many times, and I believe is still true, the fact that Advanced does not have sufficient offense to make offensive teams consistently worth running. I think special offense comes the closest because special sweepers are most robust. They're harder to KO. They get KOs easier. They're faster. So I think they're much better than their physical counterparts. I think physical offense suffers from these elements, as well as a lack of defensive cohesion. Very limited options for taking on the greater threats in the metagame, which special offense is a much easier time with, by virtue of those traits I just mentioned, in which they're superior. And I think mixed offense or trap offense without trapping or spikes, however you want to phrase it, the stuff that piles on a bunch of mixed attackers as their anti-Skarmory method, is generally insufficient as well. I find it generally confused and ineffectual in how it chooses to break through the standard team or the standard setup of Skarmory. Because remember, it's not just about breaking Skarm, Bliss, and Pert and whatever. It's about beating them and not collapsing to their own offensive onslaught. The best Skarm teams aren't the best Skarm teams because they wall you forever. It's because they wall you long enough for the sand and the spikes and the other stuff to kick in, and then their Zapdos or their Gengar, excuse me, or their Salamence or their Aerodactyl finishes you off. And that is why offense is so difficult to pull off. It's not just about breaking them, but about withstanding what they can throw at you, or their Starmie, whatever it is, their Charizard, Moltres, stuff like that. Calm Mind Jirachi, offensive Celebi of some sort. So that's where offense falters. Right? Okay, so I hope we can accept that as true. Okay, even if you don't accept that as true, that is the task that offense has to, fulfill, right? That is undeniable. And where I and many other players differ is that I don't think most offense teams are sufficient at performing this task, at least on a consistent basis. So I guess it might also be a definition thing, but the fact is that offense is not consistent. It is unreliable. It is, a huge risk. And this dynamic, I think, is even acknowledged by many players when they say, "Oh, well, how do you beat Skarm outside of using your own Skarm or a couple other very limited methods?" Because the problem is that the good methods for dealing with Skarm are very, very narrow. Like the physical offensive has to waste a slot on Magneton and then use a bunch of ineffectual sweepers piled together. Mixed offense has to break through. Uh, break through Skarm with a bunch of move sets that are compromised from greater effect. And then the fact also that people delude themselves into thinking, oh, I 3 KO Skarmory with Metagross HP Fire, so I'm okay with it. And it's not how it works at all. Um, so it's about the fact that those offensive teams generally are not so reliable at breaking through Skarm. So what do you do when you can't break through something? It's kind of similar to GSC Snorlax in this sense. Well, you're never going to out offense GSC Snorlax purely. I mean, in some games you might get a good thing going, and once the snowball starts rolling down the hill, then okay, sure. But consistently, not a chance. So what do you do? Even offensive teams, you have to slow it down somehow. And with Skarm, then whether it's matching its spikes or slowing the game down so much that you can live forever even if it spikes 3 times and stays around to wall you at that, you are generally slowing the game down. That is where consistency is found in advance. Not that offense can't work. Again, I am a big fan of special offense, and I think this has been, I can back this up uh, with the way I've actually played the game too. But the fact is, even when the chips are down, then that's when the Skarms come out from even the most ardent, oh yeah, Skarmory isn't even that good. Oh, Gengar, whatever. It's like that's exactly when people know they need to rely on it, especially in a best of one environment like SPL. And I know best of one is ridiculous, but it also shows what people really rely on, and it's more consistent styles of offense, or and if they bring less consistent stuff, then they get punished very severely. Um, or they bring out the Skarm. So this the whole point being, okay, well, with the methods for dealing with Skarm are inconsistent, other than slowing it down. So what do you do if you want to run offense? Well, you have to run riskier stuff. I mean, the whole point is that in order to, maybe be better against Skarm, you have to start doing stupid stuff like not giving up tempo ever and therefore risking move sets. Like keeping Zapdos in on T-Tar's turn one, which is a hotly debated thing. Keeping T-Tars in on Mence, just to not fall behind, not give Skarm any breathing room. But you are doing this at the expense of consistency. For you might slow down Skarm a little bit, but you also might lose to other things just because you decided to take this risk that you didn't need to. I'm all about eliminating needless risk. And it seems that the methodology of a lot of players in order to take on Skarmory, rather than use the more overall consistent methods, and I apologize for the dogs in the background, is to increase the odds, make the risk factor go up. And that is very antithetical to how I look at the game, because it's leaving the game out of your hands and just saying, well, hope this one works. So, um, yeah, so the Skarmory factor is not the only thing, but I think people are very quick to delude themselves that yes, this actually is good against Skarmory teams, because I still have these flashbacks of thinking, you know what, maybe this isn't so bad against Skarmory. Maybe this I'm overdoing it, and I would look at it over and over, and I would test it, and I would theorize, and I would test it some more, and then I would just say, no, this is just worse. So I think people have the idea that it's actually more balanced to deal with Skarmory than it is. Whether that's because they think that Magneton offense is actually good, or it's because they just don't see a problem with having to risk the game so severely and leave the game out of their hands in many situations to try and slow Skarm down. Um, I Yeah, I don't know what it is, or bringing super risky stuff that cleaves through Skarm more easily, um, Skarm itself anyway, at the cost of more offense. And I'm not saying that there's not give and take in any team building. Sorry, I'm not saying team building doesn't have give and take. Of course it does. It always does. But that's actually kind of my point. That this is not so dissimilar. People will say, "Oh, well, you need to run X, Y, Z to not lose to whatever," and insert metagame here. Well, the same exact thing happens in advance. And oh, everything's too, I saw this just the other day. Oh, these Pokemon in these tiers are too broken. It's well, there's going to be a best Pokemon in every tier, but whether it's Latios in Gen 5 or Jirachi in Gen 4 or Snorlax and Zapdos in Gen 2, it's like, okay, well, Skarmory and friends are just as bad. I don't think that's really, if you think Skarmory and friends are fine, sure, okay, I personally don't have an issue with it. But to suggest that they are somehow more balanced than these kings of the other metagames, I think that's very, very foolish. Um, yeah, I think the methods needed to reliably take on Skarmory are roughly similar to the restrictions and requirements for consistent teams that give you the option to play the game, which is kind of my whole thing, of the other metagames. So I mentioned the Skarm metagame, or the Skarm aspect. That's one thing. Number two is Dugtrio. Now, I don't necessarily think Dugtrio needs to be banned or anything like that, but I also am kind of overthinking that it's okay. I and that's fine. Not every potentially borderline broken thing is going to be kicked out of every metagame. Jirachi is probably here to stay in DPP. That's okay. Even though I personally think Ironhead should be removed, and Jirachi itself is stupid, whatever. But that's fine. Uh, but I'm also not deluding myself into thinking that Dugtrio is okay in the same way. I think whether you say, oh, it keeps the stuff in check, it's like Advance already does not have a difficult time at all keeping its offensive threats in check. That's kind of the whole thing. Like these Skarm teams I was mentioning that are the standard style, that offense has to adapt so much to just try and not collapse under. It's like that's without Dugtrio. You know, your T-Tar, Skarm, Bliss, Gengar, Pert, or Metagross, whatever, Filler, you know, Claydol, and then those other faster Pokemon I mentioned earlier. You know, where was Dugtrio in that? Nowhere. So this like standard style does not need Dugtrio at all to keep offense in check because it's a very natural balance of Skarm, Bliss, and friends being very good defensively on their own, and you know once you've broken through them, now you have to deal with their threat. That's kind of the most consistent play style in pretty much every generation. To simplify by a lot, oversimplify, but once you start getting into like the super fat Suicune, Celebi, Claydol, Blissey, I can't do damage to save my life kinds of teams, well, the only reason those don't get absolutely thrashed by, let's say, Metacham and friends is because they kind of go super, super fat and then they tack on a Dugtrio. And then that Dugtrio, you know, make sure your, you know, wall breaking, your CBT tar or Metagross or your Heracross or whatever, you know, is not going to get that far. And I think similarly to the other generations where that was a very undesirable dynamic, I also don't care for it in advance. There's a team style in advance known by the inside community as the Virgin team. And personally, I really, really hate this name because competitive Pokemon players calling each other virgins is one of the most tired, sad things you can imagine. Yes, period. Like, that's one of the worst things in the world, of course. Um, but yeah, that's what it's referred to. You know, it's Skarm, Bliss, Claydol, Milotic, and then like the fifth fluctuates to my recollection. But it's generally stuff like that. You know, the stuff I just mentioned that can't really do damage on its own to save its life. It doesn't even have sand. You can run T-Tar on it, but you don't need to. And the only reason that stuff doesn't get bowled over by this more aggressive offense stuff is because of Dugtrio. So, you know that whole thing before, like Skarmory is super busted. Like the Skarmory balance stuff, you know, with the fast Pokemon or two fast Pokemon, um, or just the more aggressive playstyle in general, because you can tweak your move sets a lot to make it more aggressive in that sense. You know, that's still a more balanced playstyle, but it's still, you know, defensive leaning and it's favored. And the reason why the super bulky stuff is favored is because you struggle to break through it largely because of Dugtrio. Because, you know, most stuff is going to be grounded. And the few non Dugtrio vulnerable wall breakers are the few non Dugtrio Pokemon you're going to be using, excuse me, on such teams are not exactly shattering them. Like, yes, DD Mence sets up on Dugtrio, okay, and DD Mence is famous for not getting the job done. Because I think DD Mence is a great Pokemon and all, but it needs a lot to work unless you want to start taking stupid risks. And that's the whole thing. You know, if you want to be consistent, then you have a very narrow set of options. Okay, that's fine. That's Pokemon for you, but you cannot act like Advance does not have this issue that the other generations do. And yeah, it's not distinct in this sense. Or you know, you can take the riskier route and sit and Hail Mary and Full of Grace, and I hope my DD Mence crits, flinches, whatever, through the opposing team that it has no business sweeping through. You know, people are very quick to say, "Oh, well, you know, DD Tar is good because you can flinch through something." It's like, okay, well, that's what about the much higher percentage where that doesn't happen? You know, um, yeah, so Dugtrio I think enables a lot of stuff. It's not just these bulky teams, of course. I think just the way Dugtrio picks things off, you know, offers a kind of get out of jail free card for uh, for offense. You know, that's the whole thing. It's punishing offense. All this stuff is about limiting offense as a consistent play style. I mean, you know, I've talked a lot about across multiple generations how the default play style, the best play style, the most reliable play style, does tend to wind up being this kind of balance, this kind of you know, mid-range balance with fast options, but it's got a good defensive core. You know, that gives the player the most control. But in, you know, other generations, you can also consistently run offense in many different forms, and in Advance, it is much less consistent. It's more consistent in GSC, for God's sake, the so-called stall uh, and Dugtrio was similarly limiting. in these other generations, and it was limiting offense, more than anything else. And it does the same in advance. And I don't think that there should be such a punish for such a wide range of Pokemon. Like, okay, if you have a CB Metagross and you get trapped on by Magneton, okay, that's one thing. Magneton is not trapping, over half of the tier. Think, oh, well, something like offensive Suicune or Swampert, with this set, it's not Dugtrio weak. Yeah, dips to about half health, and there it goes. So, Dugtrio's reach is way, way too big, and way too wide, I should say. And it extends to so much that would otherwise be an effective tool at fighting defense. So again, uphill battle, way too uphill a battle to break through this defense, in conjunction with Dugtrio or to try and Dugtrio proof your team. It's very, very difficult. And then you wonder why the best teams also tend to be teams that are very good into Dugtrio, like Skarm balance stuff. I mean, it doesn't even have to be full on Superman with the spikes immunity to be generally good against Dugtrio, because that fast Pokemon, okay, sometimes it can be Starmie, sure, but it also tends to be a flying or levitating Pokemon. Arrow, Zapdos, Charizard, Moltres, Salamence, sometimes Claydol. So not that you can't run pretty much whatever you want, but generally it tends to be that kind of thing for the Dug immunity and the Spikes immunity. So yeah, I'm generally pretty anti-Dugtrio these days. So I'm going to take a bathroom break because I'm well hydrated. So enjoy this beautiful black and white, and I'll be right back. Okie doke. So, um, let's see. What's next? Oh, this is kind of a specific one, but it also kind of leans into this whole theme of I think offense is bad in advance, and here's a million reasons why. I think Jirachi is a ridiculous Pokemon. Well, okay, I think Jirachi's a ridiculous Pokemon, not just for offense, but I think it's particularly ridiculous for offense, mostly because its status spread. First of all, its RNG influenced status stuff is ridiculous. Like Subcall Mine fishing for Ice Punch freezes is justly famous, but the way it just Fire Punch burns, it's like, yeah, well, have fun switching your T-Tar into that. But then you also realize, well, it doesn't even have to Fire Punch burn because it can just Toxic, and fishing for Fire Punch burns and doing damage at the same time, it's a very spammable move. And obviously goes beautifully with Toxic. And that kind of status spread, to say nothing of the possibility of throwing Paralysis in there. Let alone Freeze, of course. But, those are the three consistent ones, the Paralysis, the Toxic, and the Burn. And that is so limiting to offense because you can say Lumberry all you want. that just says, oh, I don't know how this works. You know, Lumberry does not stop this kind of Jirachi, because the whole point is that it has longevity. You do not. Not only do you not have this longevity that you need to, it's kind of like with Skarm. You got to go the distance. You got to nullify its ability to basically OHKO you with status. You know, with Skarm, it OHKOs you in a different way. And it doesn't really get those OHKOs in the same way, but the way it accelerates your death is very, very, very quick. So with Jirachi, it's more immediate. It's like some Pokemon, you toxic them, they're gone. It's game over. You get that Fire Punch burn, the end. So with Jirachi, again, you don't have longevity, and what's more, you don't have the power to break through it. It has two weaknesses, rare, and even those weaknesses are not doing much. I mean, physically defensive Jirachi is not 2-hit KO'd by T-Tar Earthquake, for God's sake, and all it's got to do is get that status on you, and you're toast. Like forget Stab, Swamp, or Earthquake either. That's not doing the job. Especially with Wish and Protect and leftovers. And you could say, oh, 2-turn recovery exploitable. Okay, how? And you could say substitute Lumberry, 2-turn recovery. That's just paper Pokemon for how you could theoretically exploit a Wish Protect Pokemon. It's like relying on Protect for recovery does not stop Swampert from being amazing. And Jirachi's functionally in the same position, except it can also throw up a Wish. You think Swampert would be worse if it got Wish? So, yeah, Jirachi is just as efficient a hit taker, and it brings the opposing team down very quickly. So generally, even balanced teams have to keep this status threat in mind. They can't just be ruined by Fire Punch burn. And this is why, not just Natural Cure Blissey, but also things like Refresh on Swampert are very important. Or even an offensive Zapdos might carry Rest, because otherwise it's just going to status all over you and win. Even if your team has longevity in the form of bulk, it's not necessarily going to have longevity in the form of status. And Blissey can't Natural Cure its way through everything. Celebi does a pretty good job, but even the Natural Cure Pokemon will get forced out. And then that next Pokemon comes in, and that next Pokemon's probably not going to be so good dealing with status. So if you have two Natural Cure Pokemon, okay, you're fine. But that's more restricting and more limiting, and we're getting back to the part where this restricting, limiting stuff, all goes in the favor of longevity and defense, and the offensive options for breaking through are not so good. At least with Skarm and stuff, it's not posing as big a threat offensively because it's slow. But with Jirachi, it's faster. It's harder to outspeed it. And I know I just said the same thing twice, but the point is that you have to expend more in order to try and get the jump on it. And its offensive move is a lot more threatening because Fire Punch burns. Drill Peck hits the wrong target, does nothing. Fire Punch can thud into T-Tar and do no damage at all, and it can still basically do what you need it to. Very, very risk-free. I mean, at worst, you let in Charizard or Moltres. Well, your team should be prepared for Charizard and Moltres. Why wouldn't it? I don't really believe in that whole thing where where team building is so difficult that you have to pick your poison. I think that's a very lazy excuse. And I think there are plenty of teams that take on the general metagame more than well enough, across a variety of styles. Yes, leaning defensive mostly, but the special offensive kind, for example, I think there's more than enough variety to where you don't need to make that excuse. More than enough variety in teams that are able to take on the greater metagame. So yeah, the status Jirachi thing, yes, a little specific, whatever. You got to take it into account, but it's going to do it. And it's not as easy to bring it down because Dugtrio weakness. I mean, it's not that simple either. And again, Dugtrio. So. Yeah, Jirachi, and this is to say nothing of the RNG aspect, which I think is very, very silly. But yeah, so I think status Jirachi stuff, it would be fine because, like, let's say an offensive team in like DPP or later, right? Like, yes, they also have to watch out for status. There's a reason why Lumberry has become such a popular item on DPP offense teams, or black and white, whatever. Because when the defensive team relying on passive damage, when you deny them that turn where they can just nullify you, you toxic the thing and then you protect and maybe sacrifice one thing and the threat is gone. Then if you take that away, then that becomes an offensive weapon. But in advance, that doesn't really work well enough because the offense isn't strong enough like it is in those other generations. So something like Wish Protect Jirachi is also very efficient in DPP, very difficult to break. But people say, oh well, people used to say the offense was too good in DPP, which was ridiculous, and now they say it's not good enough, which I think is also ridiculous. But I mean, I don't understand how someone can say offense isn't strong enough in DPP to break through or whatever. I mean, okay, if you're going to say that, sure, and I disagree, but I understand where it comes from. But to say that and then pretend like advanced doesn't have the same problem, that's absurd to me. So yeah, that's kind of the point of this video. It's like the same exact thing that this other tier gets criticized for is just as present and just as much of an issue, you know. And then there's also the idea that, oh well, advance is the most conducive to skill, you know, translating into a win. I don't really think that's true. I mean, I don't know how you would even quantify this, but I've observed enough Pokemon across the generations to know that that is generally nonsense. Skill gets rewarded. You know, Pokemon interferes and does stupid stuff. Sometimes there's matchup. A lot of it is a player's own fault for getting too cute, too precious, too arrogant, and deciding to ignore a certain threat and being punished for it. Because when you ignore a certain threat in the team, you know, other flaws are going to pop up as well. So, um, yeah, those are the three that mainly come to mind. I mean, I guess you could just summarize it as offense isn't good enough. Offense isn't good enough, and these are just the main casualties, or not the casualties, but these are just the main elements driving that offense not being enough. You know, you do have very powerful offensive Pokemon here, of course, but they're so limited in how they can't do the job themselves a lot, or they're very exploitable. You know, Dugtrio, or the offensive teams themselves, they're not strong and fast enough to compensate for the fact that they're going to struggle under the weight, the combined weight of Scar and Bliss and friends, passive damaging all over the place, and then unleashing the speed on them. You know, because the offensive Pokemon aren't that fast, they're not that strong, and you know, even with a boost, then they're not that destructive. And even if famously DD targets two DDs all the time, still doesn't really culminate in a sweep or even a KO sometimes. So it's just too easy to play around them, to soft check them. And I think that's a good thing that you can play around and soft check offense. I wouldn't want the opposite, where you either have a counter or you get destroyed. But I think if there is something to criticize advance for, it is this, or these elements that I have outlined, that things lean too much in the way of Skarmory and friends and, you know, longevity, and that is because there's not enough strength, you know, and the elements, and a lot of the stronger elements are really kept in check by Dugtrio. Um, and really, you don't really need Dugtrio for the health of the tier, because I think that with, you know, spikes and speed and just general good walling of everything, you don't really need it to keep anything in check. Now, the one thing about losing Dugtrio theoretically would be that Blissey is completely impossible for special offense to beat, right? But there are already some ways to take out Bliss with to take Blissey out for special offense teams without relying on Doug. Obviously, it's the most reliable, but I think you'd find a way, especially because Dugtrio is also an amazing enabler of Blissey. When you don't have, you know, half your Blissey killers a Dugtrio away from just getting ruined, then I think that opens you up a lot more, both in team and in play. And I guess that's my last point, that I also think Blissey is utterly ridiculous. I mean, you want to talk about offense not being sufficient. I'm not even talking about special attackers here, because, yeah, okay, most special attackers aren't going to be able to break through Blissey. That's fine. I'm not saying this gen really needs Focus Blast so that Gengar can threaten it without having to explode or whatever. No, what I'm saying is that even physical attackers don't get the job done half the time. I mean, it switches into Salaman's Brick Breaks, for God's sake. So, and yes, this is why attack invested Mixments is good, stuff like that. But I think I'm not saying this gen needs boosting items or anything like that. I think it's great as is. But Blissey is also extremely difficult to take down, extremely limiting, all that jazz. So that is pretty much everything I wanted to say. Really, if you're gonna praise Advance, go for it. I fully support it. But if you're gonna rag on these other gens, you got to be consistent. You know. So I hope, if nothing else, this inspired some of us to think more about, you know, why we're talking about the generations the way we are. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, found something to think about, and I'll see you in the next one.